I don't think I ever really believed everything.
And I realized that quite a few of the things didn't hold water.
The actual religions were man-made from wherever.
God? Who's God? What's God?
I think skepticism really is the first step.
Scientific zest and zeal for the real world.
That was it. I was an atheist from then on.
I knew Zeus and Hera before I knew Yahweh or Jehovah or Christ or any of those guys. So for me, when I first...
Hi, I'm Red.
Hi, I'm Susan, and this is our friend Charles here to tell us his story of his road to atheism. Welcome.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Red.
Welcome.
Okay, so in the beginning, you were born into what kind of family?
Actually, both my parents were atheists.
Oh,
Yes.
that makes it easy.
Yes, it made it easy for me intellectually because I accepted atheism from the very beginning. I never went to church regularly. My parents had a little bit of a mixed history that way. My mother was the daughter of Jewish parents who were not really believers. They were not
They were cultural
atheists.
Jews.
They were cultural Jews, and they didn't specifically repudiate God. They didn't specifically repudiate belief, but they were not avowedly atheists. My father came from a very different background. Christian missionaries.
Oh, that's interesting.
So the big rebellion, the big switch to atheism, in a way, in terms of my folks, came with my father. Because my father was an atheist, and both his parents were devout believers.
Do you know how he became an atheist? What made him?
Actually, I don't know.
Oh, okay.
By the time that I was born, and by the time I started... Also, you got to understand, my first exposure to myths and gods and all that was not Judeo-Christian. My first exposure was Greek.
Oh, yes,
classic.
in school?
Yeah, no.
No.
Well... This is sort of interesting. I was homeschooled until I was 16 years old.
Wow.
So all of my reading in terms of legends, gods, myths, all of that stuff was guided by my parents. And my first exposure in that regard were the Greek legends, Homer and so on. So the first gods I knew were Zeus and Hera. I knew Zeus and Hera before I knew Yahweh or Jehovah or Christ or any of those guys. So for me, when I first encountered Jehovah and Christ, etc., and I was introduced to them by my parents because my parents felt I should have that kind of exposure. When I was first introduced to them, I thought I just accepted them as part of the family of mythic gods. It never occurred to me that anyone thought they were real.
Yeah, that's the scary thing. I was sort of the same way too. You could say Walt Disney got me on the road to atheism the same way because myths and everything.
Your neighborhood, tell us a little about the demographics of your neighborhood.
Well, actually, it kept shifting. I was born in London, England, of American parents. We only lived there for 6 months, but that was because they were on a very long, extended honeymoon. They loved London. But they didn't change their citizenship or anything like that. They came back. I was born in 1954. They came back to Albany, New York for a brief period of time, which I do not recall. Then they moved down to a place called Sweetbriar, Virginia. There were other moves as well, but it was all about my father who kept getting these temporary teaching appointments. So we kept traveling. Sweetbriar, Virginia, which was when I was 3 and 4 years old, that I remember.
Isn't that the heart of the South and Southern churches and things like that?
That may or may not have been the case.
You were homeschooled.
But not only that, my exposure socially was to my parents' colleagues. So my exposure were to academics, very liberal, very enlightened, very free-thinking academics. I wasn't really exposed to whatever was the prevailing Virginia culture at the time when it came to religious or social matters.
Okay, so
and that continued.
You were lucky.
Well, apparently I was. After a year or so, we moved down to Gainesville, Florida. That was in 1959 when I was...
Five.
But I was still 4 years old when we moved to Gainesville, Florida. And again, it was the same thing. My father taught at the University of Florida, and my social group were composed of the academics of the University of Florida.
What subject did he teach?
History.
History.
Yeah, my mother was a specialist in English Lit.
World history or...
Actually, his specialist was medieval history.
Medieval history.
English medieval history. And my mother's specialty was English Lit. So I was surrounded by academics. So when I moved from Sweetbriar, Virginia to Gainesville, Florida, there wasn't really that much of a shift in culture. And then later when we moved to New York City in 1964, again, personally, I didn't feel any great sense of like being, taken out of one environment and being put into another. I was still basically in the same environment. So I was relatively sheltered from the cultural, religious, ethnic, racial, and so on. I was sheltered from the way things were in the South versus the way things were in the North. I was never really exposed to that great contrast.
Well, when were you exposed to it? When did you first meet the seeming obstacle of
belief.
Yes.
When did I find out that my atheism was in conflict
That's right.
with these other folks who believed in this mythic daddy in the sky? It was extremely gradual. I mean, I remember becoming aware of believers. Well, I was always aware of believers because I remember when my parents first introduced me to the Bible, for example, at that point, I think I was like 4 or 5 years old. At that point, I was already a confirmed musical buff, classical musical buff. I was into opera, etc. So I already knew the Messiah by heart. I was really into that. And Messiah, for me, was a wonderful piece of music. It had nothing to do with religion or belief or anything. It was just like, Homer wrote a great epic and Handel wrote a great piece of music. And it had nothing to do with belief or anything like that. So after I learned the Messiah, I remember my parents introducing me to the Bible and saying, now a lot of the people, for example, in the Messiah, they used the Messiah as an example. A lot of the people who revere and celebrate the Messiah, who are big fans of the Messiah, do so not just because they think it's a great piece of music, but because they think it's a great testament.
Handel's Messiah.
Yeah, Handel's Messiah. It's a great testament to the Christian religion. And that's what the meaning is for so many people, because many people really believe this stuff. And I remember at one point my father actually telling me, you may, in the coming years, perhaps, decide you do believe some of this stuff.
At what age was this one?
This was, I think I was like 6 or 7 years old.
Did
as I
your
recall.
6 or 7?
family
Something like that.
celebrate Christmas with Santa
Yes.
Claus?
Yes, no, not with Santa
Not
Claus,
with
but
Santa
we did celebrate it. There was a tree, there were gifts, etc. Yes, we did celebrate.
Homeschooling, did it involve science?
Science no, it was actually somewhat soft pedal. There was English lit, a lot of English lit, a lot of history. There was some math, just enough to get me by until I took the GEDs when I was 16 and I passed. And then when I entered college when I was 16, that's the first time I was exposed to hard science like biology and stuff like that.
Okay. Your background in education, mostly homeschooled.
Until college, yes.
Until college. And when you got into college, did you find any problems there? Did you meet any people, any discussions?
Politically, religiously, and culturally, there were no problems at all. Because these were folks who had chosen a liberal arts education. So there was a commonality of background. There was a commonality of perspective. Socially, I was like a fish out of water. The first couple of years socially in college for me was very tough. As far as the question of belief versus non-belief, no. I think this may have partly to do with what was happening at that time. This was the early 70s. We had just come out of the 60s era, with free love and drugs and free and open sexual relationships, etc. So there was a tendency to emphasize free thinking. And it was an era when the idea that you had to worship a certain god or follow a certain religion was not very cool, frankly. So I think I lucked out in the sense that in college, I never really encountered a strong clash between, as an atheist, with believers.
I mean, which
Franklin
college?
and Marshall College. That was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is a liberal arts college.
The thought of critical thinking and deductive reasoning, which is paramount in college. Okay. Did that hit you during the freshman year or sophomore or when?
At the risk of sounding very conceited, I think I was already familiar with that discipline.
Okay.
I already used it.
The reason why...
And it wasn't a shock to me to encounter that way of thinking.
Okay, well, okay, good. The reason why I'm saying that is that when you have a discussion with anybody, did you ever cover anything in the Bible? I know you said you didn't read it that much.
Right.
Okay. Did anybody ever bring that up to you? Or did you have any thoughts about that or be able to confirm some of the anecdotes as far as comedy type of things that are written in there? They're about
absurdities.
Absurdities are about more than that. There are about over 740 contradictions that are in the Bible. Okay.
No,
a lot
really?
of errors.
The believers say there are none.
A lot of errors and plagiarism. Noah's Ark is a plagiarism because it comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a poem. Right. So those are the type of things that I want to know. Did you ever confront that?
No, I didn't have to deal with that because I think I would have confronted it if I had been directly confronted with my atheism by a believer. But anything like that really didn't happen to me, not even in graduate school. I went to Catholic University until I hit a second graduate school, University of New Orleans.
Or you went to a Catholic university?
Catholic University, yes. But believe it or not,
Oh.
my atheism was never an issue at Catholic University. I was in the drama department, and people were focused on performing and acting and
Jesuit
directing.
school?
Interesting.
Catholic University, I don't think so. Boy, it's interesting. I don't know what the religious background of that is. I just know the only problem I encountered in Catholic University was my MA thesis was never accepted because part of it was an argument that the Catholic religion had damaged the performance tradition of King Lear. For those of you familiar with the performance tradition of King Lear, around the 18th century, mid to late 18th century, a guy named Nahum Tate wrote a rewrite of King Lear where everything ended happily because it was deemed that the unhappy ending of King Lear was inappropriate, was not morally uplifting. And this was largely a result of religious pressure, perhaps not Catholic pressure, but religious pressure, and that persisted. That performance tradition persisted into the 19th century, and we really didn't start getting away from that until the late 19th, early 20th century, which was what my thesis was about. But since it posited that religion had distorted and damaged the performance tradition of King Lear, a tradition which it only started gradually to recover from over the previous 100 years, I think that was found objectionable. I was never told that. The thesis kept getting sent back with this nitpick and that nitpick. But I think that was what was at the heart of it.
What kind of work do you do generally?
Well, now I'm retired. I was a news editor, a videotape news editor.
Did you have any problems with on the job as far as your fellow colleagues working? Some questions might have come up in that.
Right. No, I remember unique individuals. I remember this one guy who didn't smoke, who didn't drink, who believed in God, and who was trying to proselytize and get everyone converted.
Oh, excellent.
I dealt with him a few times, not in connection with religion, but in connection with other matters. But there was a definite hostility from him towards me, and I remember him being very uncooperative. I remember at one point we were working on this dub of some soap opera, and I was saying we need to check the quality of that recording. We need to, we just made it. Take 5 minutes, fast forward through, check a few sections. He said, no, we don't have time. We don't have time. And I said, yes, we do have time. We have another 2 hours on the clock. He said, but this is our last job. We can go home after it, And and I sensed that even though the discussion wasn't about religion and belief, I sensed that was where the hostility was coming from. But that sort of occurrence is so rare in my life that it stands out in my mind, even though that was in the mid-'80s.
He proselytized to you about religion?
No, he didn't. I knew he was a proselytizer. He wore a cross, and I knew that I heard him get into arguments with other people. Maybe he knew better than to get into an argument with me because I was already... I had told I would tell anybody who would listen that I was an atheist, and very, 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 very few people. Yes, because very, very few people ever challenged me on that. The first person who challenged me on a consistent basis on that was a friend of mine, Catherine, who worked also at NBC, and that came later. That was in the late '80s, and I remember she and her mother and me getting into a discussion about that. Not really an argument. We weren't raising our voices, but definitely a discussion about it. Catherine was a strong, Catholic. They were both Catholic.
What about the Jewish culture? Did you meet any religious Jews that might have brought up something during a bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, or during one of the Seder or something like that?
No, I honestly don't recall having an episode like that.
Okay.
I do remember my grandmother on my father's side, who was very religious, one of those Christian missionaries. I do remember her showing up once, I think, in the early 70s at our house, and talking about and complaining about the fact that we had never gone to church, that we had never looked at the Christian religion seriously.
Were you christened?
I never. No.
So she probably was pissed at that too.
Oh yeah, I'm sure she was.
What was the response of your parents when she did that?
They were hostile. I remember them being hostile. In fact, my mother couldn't stand her. My mother and my grandmother on my father's side used to get into fights, used to get into real knockdown, drag-out fights. I do remember that. But my mother was a combative person. She would get into fights with everyone. So
okay, well, one of the reasons why we're asking these questions is that the people in the audience are some of them are those who are fence straddlers. They're coming out of the closet or would like to, and of course they'd like to hear some of the sequences of which you were successful in handling certain problems, and that's the reason why we mentioned about the job, about your education and things like that. Is there anything that you would like to say to the audience as far as good thoughts of your mind, as far as experience or good words of wisdom?
Right. Let's see. I can say that the most important conflict in terms of religious belief that I've encountered in my life, I think, happened during my last years at work, during the aughts and during my retirement, because I have an identical twin brother. He was an atheist like me until he got married in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And by the time 2000 rolled around, he had become a believer.
So in his 40s, he became a believer?
In his 40s, he became a believer. And I do remember at one point feeling that he was trying to proselytize me, that he was trying to convert me.
Was it because of his wife, or?
Yeah, I think it was because of his wife, yeah.
But he was also raised like you, homeschooled, taught Zeus, about Zeus was his first god and all that. So.
Precisely. So in terms of the question you've asked, what do we say to the audience? What do I say as the audience as somebody who's gone through that? I think in terms of conflict, what I have to rest on is how I handle the conflict with my brother. When you are confronted by someone who really is trying to change you, who's really trying to tell you your atheism is wrong, belief is the way to go, and I can convince you that belief is the way to go, I think you have to be very firm. I think you have to make clear your effort to convert me, your effort to proselytize me is unwelcome. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of like a good analogy, perhaps, is political belief or even sexual orientation. Mm-hmm. I mean, if a conservative approaches me and tells me that I believe in war, I believe in the Iraq War, I believe in an aggressive fist, etc., and I think you're wrong about this, and I think I can persuade you otherwise, you can engage the conversation, but, let the person know up front, I don't think you can change my mind. I mean, if I'm a straight person, if a gay person approached me and tried to persuade me, I think you're gay, I think it's the same thing. I respect your homosexuality, respect my heterosexuality. A lot of what's going on, I think, between atheism and believers is respect, is an issue of respect. My sense is that a lot of you out there are discovering as atheists, now that we're starting to come out, now that we're starting to be more aggressive about our identity, we're discovering that many people look down on our beliefs either because they think they're silly or ridiculous or because they think they're immoral. Now, I think there's an interesting analogy with other civil rights movements in the sense that I think before people become aware that they have civil rights which are being violated, before people become aware that there's a problem here, they go through a phase where they're not militant about, they're not upfront about it, and as far as they're concerned, they don't see any conflict, they don't see any fight here, they don't see any problem here, they're being accepted, they don't see any people attempting to fight them, combat them, or oppress them, or change their minds or anything. But once you start showing a little identity, once African Americans started showing up at lunch counters, once gays started showing up at political rallies and saying, what about AIDS? Once atheists start showing up publicly and saying, we do not believe, we do not think that under God should be on the currency. We do not think under God should be in the Pledge of Allegiance. We do not think that prayers should be part of a secular governmental institution, etc. That's when you find out there's a problem here, there's a conflict here. So the first reaction that you will encounter as atheists coming out for the first time is you will encounter hostility that you will have not seen before, and that hostility will surprise you. And people challenging you will surprise you. You will not expect it. But it's there, be prepared. I think, in other words, it's not advice what to do about it, but just a warning that this is what's going to happen. So I think that's what I'd say to you out there who are starting to not only self-identify as atheists, but coming out as atheists. I think that's the sort of the question you were asking?
That's exactly what we're asking for. And I would like to put something on top of that by saying, and you had the key word there, and that is being prepared. A little bit of knowledge about science, a little bit of knowledge about the Bible, the history, and some of the false things that are in there are very important, because when you do meet people and you do have discussions, it's good to be forearmed, if not forewarned about that. Mm-hmm. And when you do have that, you will have an air of confidence behind you, so you'll be able to handle those type of things. And coming out really involves just that, is to have a little bit of confidence and be prepared.
And it's good that nowadays there are a lot of books you can read on analyzing the validity of the Bible. And
in addition to the internet, you have a number of things on that. Ken, would you like to add something to that?
Do you think we should be aggressive atheists?
I certainly think we should out ourselves. I think that's very important. I mean, that's something that you taught me, Ken, and that is that the movement to establish a space, a civic space, a political space for atheists in this country should model itself to some extent on the move we've seen in the last 10, 15 years for the rights of homosexuals. An important part of that was coming out and self-identifying. And I think there's a very close analogy between that situation and the situation of atheists. And I think atheists would do well to study what happened with homosexuals in the last 15 years. It's an excellent model.
I think we can add two things in, not only be prepared, but be proud.
Okay, let me ask you specifically, how do you respond when someone goes up to you and says, you have to prove there's no God?
The burden of proof is not on me. The burden of proof is on you.
He's the debater.
You're positing the existence of a creature. You have to give me some indication or some proof of the existence of a creature. It is not incumbent on me to prove the absence of a creature.
There's also Isaac Asimov's famous, when asked, did he believe in God? He would ask, which God? So you could say, well, do you believe in Zeus? You know, because they're not going to believe in Zeus or Odin or Amun-Ra, you know. So
in science, we say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
I think the most important thing at this point that we could all do is self-identify and out ourselves. I would like every atheist in America to turn to their coworker, their colleague, their family member, their spouse, their kids, their parents, and say, I am an atheist. I think that's very, very important.
Do you think, why are people afraid to do that?
There has been it has to do with bigotry and prejudice. An outstanding and prevailing bigotry and prejudice against atheists is that atheists are immoral. If I had a dime for every time I've heard, well, you don't believe there's an existence of a God, so how do you determine right and wrong?
Have they read the Old Testament?
Yeah.
I mean, that,
How do you determine right and wrong? And in other words, the implication is, well, since you're an atheist, you're immoral. You don't believe in right and wrong, you cannot be trusted. I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean by example. Examples of what?
Examples of atheists are immoral?
Oh, you mean in popular culture?
Yeah.
Off the top of my head?
Well, turn the question around, okay? When somebody says that, you can say, well, was Lot's daughters immoral? Do you know about that?
I don't remember the story, but I can tell you this much.
Yeah.
In terms of immorality, there are plenty of religious believing people who are immoral.
Yeah.
I mean,
the majority of people in prisons are Christians.
Well, that I didn't know.
Atheists are a small percentage, so
that I didn't
so
know.
much for morality.
I would go more global. I would say the fact of the matter is human beings are capable of doing evil things, killing people, murdering people, massacring people. And if you look at the people who have murdered, who have massacred, etc., they come in all shapes and sizes. They come in the shape of Christians, in the shape of Jews, in the shape of atheists, etc. I mean, a good example, right now, there are people claiming to be Muslims and committing mayhem.
Yes.
In the 30s and 40s, some of the bloodiest regimes in history were self-proclaimed atheists, atheist regimes.
No.
Russia specifically, Soviet Union specifically.
Well, Russia was...
But I think Stalin. I think the answer...
Hitler was Catholic.
Yeah, Hitler was.
Yes, he was, right.
I think the bottom line, though, is that human beings will always do immoral things. They will always do awful things. They are always capable of murder and mayhem. And the excuse they use to justify that can be anything under the sun. But those excuses are meaningless.
Such as the Crusades, such as the Inquisition,
right, exactly.
Such as the murdering of women, of witches on Salem. Okay, when I mentioned to you about Lot's daughters had got their father drunk and then had sex with him. And why? Because they wanted to carry on the family name. Speak about immorality.
Well, look at Lot. He was offering his daughters to be raped by men.
Absolutely.
Talk about immoral.
That was the guests that came by the house. There are many things like that, but I was just giving an example. But things can be turned around, and that's the thing that you want to be able to say. When somebody comes to you with those type of questions, if you have a little bit of knowledge, because you know their basis of knowledge is the Bible. You see? Right. And since the basis of knowledge is the Bible, okay, well, on that basis, did you know that in the Bible, such and such and such?
Okay.
Did you know that if you happen to work on the Sabbath, that according to the Old Testament, you are to be killed? You ought to be brought to the city gates and stoned to death. This is some of the things I'm just saying. If you have a little bit of knowledge, you can do that, but you don't necessarily have to do that.
Well, there's also the opposite
there's
approach.
science. There's science that you can use.
And there's also the opposite approach, where you can deduce examples in reality, non-biblically related examples, which illustrate
empirical evidence.
Yeah.
It's called empirical evidence. Scientific evidence showing that it's absolutely ridiculous on many different levels.
And that external evidence can illustrate either that morality is not the province of religious people, or that morality is practiced on the part of non-believers. So you could deduce both sides of that argument.
Current events that occur today are good examples of immoral acts.
Yes.
Killing of so many people in the church when they're trying to let people in. There's so many different ways that you can do. And of course, that is for our audience to keep in mind that by having that knowledge is to be actually forearmed and forewarned and be able to handle themselves a little bit more confident when they get out there and step out of that proverbial
Well, you have a good background in that you were taught about, the Greek deities.
Right.
And all over the world, all these thousands of tribes had their own versions of a deity or deities, so that you ask a religious person if they believe in Zeus or Odin and Amun-Ra or, even Krishna or whatever, they're going to say no. So you're just, they're 99% atheists in that respect, and you're just one more percentage not believing in that biblical make-believe creature.
Like we say, the only difference between you and I is I just believe in one less God than you.
That's right.
That's good. I like that.
That's
So we're all, and by the way, when the Christians came out, or the Romans were around, they used to call them atheists because they didn't believe in the pagan gods. So this just history repeats itself.
the Romans believe in Mithra.
Well, and Zeus and Isis and Horus.
Jove, Jupiter.
Roman,
Jove,
not
right.
the Greek,
Variation.
Roman.
Jupiter.
Right,
Jupiter.
Jove,
Jupiter.
And what was Juno?
right.
Yep, Juno and Apollo.
Athena instead
Venus.
of Minerva. Athena instead of Minerva. There were Venus
Athena was
instead
the
of
Greek one.
Aphrodite.
Yeah.
They had more interesting gods than we have now.
Yes.
It's boring now, right?
Well, actually, all the gods really are superheroes.
There is no collection of gods that beats the Greek gods. I'm sorry. They're the best.
Yeah, but look at Thor. He's a superhero now. That was very clever of Marvel to show how most of these old gods really were nothing but made-up superheroes. Only they'd call them gods instead of, superheroes.
Do you know that we have tabling?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Okay. Have you ever participated in that? Or?
No, I haven't.
Okay. For those out there in the audience, the tabling occurs during warm months of the year from May all the way to October, and it's on Saturdays from 11 a.m. until 6 p.m. So
At
if you're
Columbus
at
Circle.
Columbus Circle, right. And so if you're interested by the CNN building, you're welcome to participate on that. And we'd like to see you out there because there are a lot of people who are fence straddlers who would like to know more information and you'll be able to sit down and talk with them, and you'll get some knowledge about that as well. It's a good place to be. I want to thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
And thank you, Ken.